Hello everyone, welcome to session 6 of module 4, choosing a test technique. In this session, we will learn about different factors which affect the choice of test technique. So let's get started. So the choice of test technique depends on many factors. What are the factors that affect the choice of test techniques? These are some of the factors that on which the choice of test technique depends. For example, the type of system you are testing, what are the regulatory standards or requirements that you need to consider while you are testing the software, and if there is any specific requirement from customer that this type of test technique has to be applied while you are testing the application, then what are the risks or level of risks associated with the software, what are the test objectives, what is the knowledge of testers. If the tester is more knowledgeable, he might apply different techniques like exploratory based techniques as compared to a fresh tester who will be more comfortable applying the more structured based testing techniques. Then what is the documentation available, if there are any time and budget requirements or any previous experience of types of defects found while the testing was done for the previous releases. So these are some of the factors which decide which test technique will be used while you are doing the testing. So test techniques cannot be classified as best or worst. Each test technique is best fit for certain types of tests and not fit for some other tests. So the test technique, you cannot classify any technique as better technique and other technique not good technique or something like that. So there is nothing best or worse. Depending on the situation, depending on different factors that we'll discuss later, you need to choose the best possible test technique which will be the best fit in that scenario. So there is no best and worst in test technique. Some techniques are fit for all levels of testing, while some are fit for just some levels of testing and some situations. So some techniques you can apply at all levels of testing, unit, integration, system, user application testing. But some of the testing techniques are just fit for certain situations or some test levels. Then it's always recommended to use variety of test techniques to ensure efficient testing. So it's always recommended that you include many different types of test techniques to test different scenarios in the software or different factors that are associated with the software, and make sure that effective testing has been done. Unless and until you apply multiple test techniques, you won't be able to have an effective testing for the software. So it's always recommended you use a variety of test techniques for testing the software. Then structure-based techniques can find issues with software code. So here we'll take some examples. So for example, if you are doing a structure-based testing techniques, if you are using structure-based techniques, then these techniques are used to find issues with just software codes. So the white box test techniques are only to find issues with the software code that developers are developing in some software language, in programming language. And if there are part of specifications which are missing from the code, then only specification based or black box test design techniques will be able to find them. So suppose you have a specification, you have a requirements document, and the code that is being delivered misses that requirement. So in that case, only black box test design techniques will be able to find those missing requirements that are not being implemented in the code, because you will be doing functional testing. So your test cases will be mapped back to the requirements. So if requirement says that functionality 1 should be there in the software, in the build that is delivered by the developer, and you have test cases for that functionality one that needs to be there in the code. But if the code doesn't have that functionality, your test cases that you have designed using black box test design technique will be able to find out that that functionality is not available in the code. So this gap you are able to find only because of the black box test design technique or specification based test design technique, because you had the specifications and the code that is delivered doesn't fulfill that specification. So in this case, black box or specification based test design technique will be effective. Then if there are things missing from specifications and code, then only experience based techniques can find them. But so suppose there is a missing requirement itself from specification document or the software requirement specification. The requirement itself is completely missing that should have been there, based on the experience, the knowledge that a tester has gained while testing the previous similar kind of softwares. So if he finds that such a requirement should be there, but it's not there in the specification and in the code, then these type of issues can only be found by experience based techniques based on the prior experience of a tester who is testing that software. So experience based testing technique find issues with missing requirements and code implementation for any very important specification. Then equivalence partitioning and boundary value analysis are unlikely to find state transition defects or decision table defects. So one technique will be able to find specific type of defect. So state transition defect or decision table testing defects will be different as compared to defects found by equivalence partitioning and boundary value analysis. So that is why we need to do a mix and match of different test techniques once we start software testing in the software testing lifecycle. So how to choose most appropriate test technique? So the decision for choosing the most appropriate test technique depends on number of factors. So let's discuss what are the factors on which decision of choosing the appropriate technique depends. So there are internal factors, which can be models that are used while developing the software, testers' knowledge or experience, what are the likely defects, which areas might have the defects based on prior experience, what are the test objectives, what documentation is available in the team, and what are the life cycle model being followed. So these are the internal factors. Internal factors are the factors which are internal to the team which is developing the software. So it's kind of whole software development life cycle factors that may influence test technique, choosing the test technique. And the others are external factors, which are the risks that are associated with the software release, what are the customer requirements, what are the contractual requirements, then what are the type of software system being developed, is there any regulatory requirement as well, or if there are any time and budget constraints as well while you are developing the software. So these are two factors which affect the decision for choosing the most appropriate test technique. So we'll discuss these internal and external factors one by one and see how they affect the selection of test technique. So let's go ahead and see what are the internal factors. So suppose models used. So choosing a test technique is dependent on the model used in specification and design. So for example, in the software requirement specification or the design document, if there is a decision table being used for designing the software, or there is a state transition diagram being used, then choosing decision table testing will be the best fit if decision table has been specified as a model in design document. And if the model used during specification is state transition diagram, then state transition testing will be the best fit if state transition diagram is already available in the specification and design document. So based on the models used in your design documents, high level design and low level design, you choose the test techniques. So that's one factor, internal factor, that affects the decision of making a decision of test technique. Then the other factor is tester's knowledge and experience. So if the tester has good domain expertise and software experience, that will also influence the test technique to choose. If the tester has good domain expertise and experience in testing similar kind of softwares, he will choose the test technique based on his experience. So experience based techniques can be used in this case along with the formal test techniques. So he can choose the formal test techniques based on the documentation and different models that are available, and then he can also use his prior knowledge and experience to decide what areas of what modules of software need to be tested thoroughly. So his knowledge and experience will be another factor which will decide the test technique to use. So in this case, he can use experience-based techniques. Then the likely defects. Another factor is likely defects. So if tester knows the modules of likely defects by his experience of testing previous versions of software, then that can also be applied in choosing test technique. So for example, tester is very experienced in testing similar kind of applications, or he has already been testing past 10 releases of this software, then he knows what are the areas where the defects where the defects are found, which are the modules which had most number of defects in previous releases. So that experience and that knowledge will help him to choose test technique. And then if there were many boundary value issues in previous version, then you should choose boundary value analysis for current version as well. So if an experienced tester has been figuring out a lot of boundary value and equivalence partitioning issues in the past releases as well, then based on his prior experience, he knows that there might be new modules which are coming in, and there might be a possibility that boundary value and equivalence partitioning issues might still be there in the new version as well. So he will try to utilize those test design techniques in this version as well. Then what are the other internal factors? So test objective. So if the test objective is to gain confidence in end-to-end system, then use case testing is good idea. So based on test objective as well, test design techniques are being finalized. Test techniques are being finalized. So suppose the main objective of testing is to gain confidence, end user confidence in end-to-end scenarios, then use case testing is most effective in that case, because use case testing is a testing wherein you test end-to-end scenarios based on end users interaction with the software, how the end user will interact with the software, and you try to figure out that none of the most used end user features are being broken. So in this case, use case testing is a good idea. If the objective is to do more thorough testing, then you need to have a more detailed test technique. For example, you need to apply black box testing technique and white box testing technique to do a thorough testing. So based on test objective as well, you can the decision of test technique depends. Then the documentation that is available. So if documentation is available, then formal test techniques are good fit. In case documentation is not available or incomplete, then experience-based techniques are the best fit techniques, because in experience-based techniques you learn the software while you test it, and then from that path itself you try to figure out which modules to test next, and you keep on finding issues while you are learning the software. Since you do not have any solid documentation available, any formal documentation available, so formal test techniques won't be a good fit in this case. The content of documentation also influences the test technique. So for example, if the documentation contains decision table technique, decision table already in the design document, then you can utilize decision table technique from the documentation available and design your test cases accordingly. Then software lifecycle model. So if sequential lifecycle model like waterfall model is chosen, then formal testing techniques are good fit. But if iterative development model or agile development model is being followed, then it's always good to have exploratory testing. Because in sequential life cycle model like waterfall model, it's everything is formal. So you, once requirements are being finalized, then you enter into design phase. Once design are being finalized, then you enter into your coding phase, and once coding is being finalized, then you enter into testing phase. So unless and until the documents are being finalized, you do not move to the next phase in waterfall model. So in sequential life cycle model, you will be having a formal list of documentation that you can use to design your test cases and decide on test techniques to use. But in iterative development model or extreme programming, you do not have that formal kind of that extensive documentation that is there in waterfall model, and because of that, exploratory testing is good fit in iterative development models. Then let's see what are the external factors. So first external factor is the risks. So if more risks are associated with software, more thorough test techniques are required. So for example, if you are testing safety critical or medical life support softwares, then you need to be more thorough while you are testing those software. So in these kind of softwares, you need to apply almost all the formal test techniques whichever are possible: black box testing, white box testing, decision table. So whatever techniques are possible, depending on different modules of this software, you need to apply all the formal approaches of test techniques. But if the time to release to market is more important, so suppose there is a software which is not life critical, which is not very critical to the people who will be using it, it's just say a social networking website or something, and time to release to market is more important, then exploratory testing will be a good fit rather than doing all sort of formal testing for those kind of applications. Then if there are some customer or contractual requirements, so customer has made contractual agreements to use specific test techniques. So suppose customer has already asked you to do white box all decision table testing and statement decision table testing, decision coverage and statement coverage. So if he has already specified that in contractual agreement, then that's another factor that decides which test technique you will be using. So if customer has said that you have to use this technique, then your test technique will be based on the contractual agreement that customer has made. Then based on the type of software or system, so depending on the type of software, test techniques are influenced. So state transition testing and decision table testing are good fit for bank ATM software. So if you would have ever had a chance to test bank ATM software, so bank ATM software is more of decision table or state transition testing will be a good fit for testing any bank ATM software. But if you are testing a financial software of a bank which requires a lot of mathematical calculations, in that case equivalence partitioning and boundary value analysis are best fit because they require a lot of mathematical calculation. So these techniques will be able to find defects related to any calculations or boundary values in the software. And with the bank ATM, state transition testing will be able to find issues with any of the transitions that happen in the bank ATM software. Then what are the other factors? So regulatory requirements. So if there are industry standards and there are regulatory requirements for a particular type of software, then you need to those test techniques which are mentioned in the regulatory requirement. For example, if you are testing aircraft or medical or defense industry software, then they have specific regulatory requirement which the software has to follow. Unless and until software follows those requirements, regulatory requirements, that software won't be accepted by these industries. So if you are developing software for aircraft, medical and defense, test techniques or testing of that software will depend on the regulatory requirements for those industries. Then time and budget. So if time left to release a software is another major factor, then it will also influence test technique. If you have to release a software in another month and you do not have time to test the software thoroughly, then you need to use exploratory based testing technique too, so that you are able to release the software within time. And if more time is available, then more test strategies can be used, or more different type of test techniques can be used. So to conclude, in this session we learned about how to choose most appropriate test technique depending on the following factors. So we saw internal factors, some of the internal factors which are models used, testers knowledge, experience, likely defects, test objective, documentation and life cycle model. So these were some of the internal factors which affect the test technique in the software testing, which affect what you need to choose, which test technique you need to choose. And then there are some external factors which affect the test technique. So for example, risks, customer requirements, any contractual requirement, or different what type of software system you are testing, what are the regulatory requirements based on the industry, for example medical or aircraft or defense application, or are there any time and budget constraints. So based on different factors you will choose different test techniques which best fit to test the software. Thank you.